Thank you for downloading this Real Agriculture podcast. Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca.
Real Agriculture brings you Real Ag Radio on SiriusXM Rural Radio 147, Canada's only national agricultural focus show on the platform and in Canada. And Sean Haney of Real Agriculture and host of Real Ag Radio joining us on Canada Now. You know, Sean, it's always a pleasure. We appreciate your taking the time.
Yeah, it's great to be back. It's fantastic. And post-World Series, were you cheering for the Dodgers, Jeff?
Are you kidding me? I'm a Yankees fan. I'm still hurting. And it bothers me that you even brought it up.
Yeah, that didn't work out. It kind of anticlimactic a little bit. It didn't end up being the classic that we thought it was going to be. But, I'm a Blue Jays fan. You got to there's always next year.
Well, yes, the Blue Jays anthem. There's always next year. And hopefully they'll get back to former glory. And that fifth inning in Game 5 of the World Series for the New York Yankees kind of felt, I would think, like the Democrats last night in the election in losing to Trump. And that's where we wanted to kind of approach our conversation this time around, Sean, because farmers were surveyed before the U.S.'s presidential election in the latest Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index and asked who they thought would be better for Canadian agriculture as president. Now, 37% of respondents said Harris was the better option. 18% said Trump. 46% either weren't sure or figured the outcome wouldn't be better nor worse based on Harris or Trump. But knowing what you know, how do you think Canadian farmers are feeling right now about the results of the U.S. presidential election?
Yeah, not a good night for Democrats. I saw this morning a stat. There wasn't a single Democrat district that they improved on their percentage numbers compared to 2020. Very poor showing by the Democrat side of the aisle. From a Canadian agriculture perspective, I would say there's a bunch of different ways to look at this, okay? The American voter voted the way they did, mainly based on exit polls on the economy. It kind of gets back to that James Carville, it's the economy stupid. There's clearly an increased belief that the best way to fix the American economy is through the Republican side of the aisle and Donald Trump. We'll see how that plays out. Canada's economy is very tied to the U.S. economy. It is our number one trade partner. So some believe that if the American economy improves and really starts to hum, that's good. That's good. That's going to help out Canada's economic troubles, and we have had more economic troubles than the U.S. has over the last 4 years coming out of the pandemic. There's no doubt about that. But there's a persistent concern here about trade issues, and so that's kind of the caveat. That's the disclaimer to that statement I just made. We've heard a lot of tough talk, which is sort of, in Trump 2.0, we can expect kind of the same playbook. Talk tough, high amount of tariffs. We're going to do this. Or, last week I heard him on the campaign trail talk about how, the U.S.'s allies are worse to them than their enemies. It kind of feels like a little bit of a rerun of what we heard from 16 through 20. But overall, I think agriculture is a little bit concerned.
Well, yeah, and again, those numbers for the farmers that were surveyed in the latest Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index, 37% of respondents said Harris was the better option, 18% on Trump. And why Trump? Well, you talked about it. Being stronger on economic policy was a big part. Why Harris? Her value of trade agreements, support for U.S.-Canada relationships, and her position on agricultural tariffs. So I want to go back to a conversation that you had last week, Sean, with Graham Crosby and Justin Shepard, both senior economists with Farm Credit Canada, about 3 agricultural policies and their impacts on Canadian industry. And the first was VCOOL, or Voluntary Country of Origin Labeling. Tell us about the bill on the product of USA label for meat processors and how that'll affect Canada.
Yeah, I'll get right there. I just want to go back 1 second. Here's kind of a Canadian perception that I'm not sure is accurate. I was surprised that Canadian farmers said that they thought that Harris valued free trade higher than Trump. Because as a senator, Kamala Harris was one of the 9 senators that voted against the USMCA happening, or CUSMA, as we call it in Canada. Not exactly known as like a free trader. Now, quieter, maybe not as boisterous, but I to be honest, I think the 23% that said either, like, they're the same, I think those are the people that I would have voted with them. That's kind of how I see it from my perspective, is that neither party right now is very much about free trade. Definitely growing protectionist sentiment in the U.S. And whether we have a Prime Minister Trudeau or we have a Prime Minister Poilievre headed into the review of the CUSMA agreement, they have their work cut out for them. I have to laugh. A couple days ago, Pierre Poilievre was tweeting about how we need to have a softwood lumber deal. That looks a little bit more out of reach as of this morning than it did 48 hours ago. Now, when it comes to the product of USA labeling, this is some very restrictive requirements the U.S. is trying to push through. They say it is voluntary. But, I talked to the Canadian Pork Council this morning, and them and groups like the Canadian Cattle Association are very concerned that this is like as you said, V-cool that's really M-cool, which is mandatory. So it's sort of like a voluntary in branding, but it forces a mandatory follow-through because packers aren't going to want to segregate the animals. Essentially, the animal has to be bred, born, raised, slaughtered, and processed, packaged in the United States to have that product USA label. It is greatly going to impact the Canadian livestock sector.
The next bill you discussed with Graham Crosby and Justin Shepherd, again, senior economists with Farm Credit Canada, was the Inflation Reduction Act, part of which includes a tax credit change in the U.S. regarding biofuel production, and that's going to be implemented January 1st.
Yeah, and we don't even have all the details on an important tax credit component of that being 45Z. This is another, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was put in place under the Biden administration, meant to deal with inflation. It's more than just that. In the U.S., a lot of Republicans will frame it as it's an environmental bill. I have always thought of it as a jobs bill. As I talk to economists in Canada, they always mention the IRA as a mechanism, a lot of money being deployed quickly to attract capital from countries like Canada into the United States. Canada does not have a similar sort of program to the same dollar substance matter, even on a per capita basis. And so one of the things they're trying to do is push biofuels, sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, as well as renewable diesel, for example. With 45Z, this tax credit, what they're trying to do, they're now talking about where it has to be domestically produced feedstock in the United States, which would remove the opportunity for Canadian-produced soybeans or canola from participating in a pretty substantial tax credit. We're for processors. We're talking about a tax credit of $1 a gallon at the pump. That is substantial from a subsidization standpoint. So that's the kind of thing the Canadian market is up against, especially under a Trump administration that may have control of the House, looks like to have the Senate, and it's going to be difficult for Canada to lobby its way out of things like domestic requirements like I just talked about.
Sean Haney of Real Agriculture and host of Real Ag Radio joining us on Canada Now. And finally, we talk about the U.S. Farm Bill, which can impact insurance prices and can change how conservation programs are run. Changes in the U.S. can impact Canadian pricing as well on that front. And there are 3 policies there that are, for the most part, Sean, out of Canada's control, but could definitely influence Canadian agriculture.
Yeah, you're talking about a farm bill that's going to be, I don't know, over $1 trillion, $1.3 trillion in nature. They renegotiate the farm bill every 5 years. They've had a hard time in the current Congress to find compromise on the farm bill. Really no chance of it happening now in the lame duck between now and January when we have the inauguration of President Trump. So it'll happen afterwards. It'll be relatively easy for them if they have control of all three areas of government. This is a policy that's U.S.-based that does have agricultural impacts in Canada because there tends to be programming in dollars that steer farmers in the U.S. to certain commodities. So, enhancing the return if you grow corn versus maybe a crop like wheat. There is some indication and some signals for farmers based on some of that farm assistance programming that does have an impact on supply, which then impacts prices. Because remember, Canadian farmers, for pretty much all the commodities we're growing and producing, except for, say, dairy or poultry, those prices are derived by the global market, but more so they're priced in U.S. dollars based on the U.S. futures. So the price of the U.S. futures market on something like wheat or corn, soybeans, is going to have an impact here for sure. And we've seen a reduction in the Canadian dollar as of late that is a positive for exporters, but definitely hurts us when we're having to import things like machinery or fertilizer. So we've got some real testy times ahead of us here, Jeff, and the U.S. Farm Bill, when they do complete it, it's going to be quite farmer friendly, I would think, based on how we saw farmers come out in very strong support, even in Republican districts, increasing their amount of support for President Trump at the top of the ticket and down the ticket last night. So I would expect a pretty strong farmer-friendly farm bill when it comes out.
Okay, this is trying to be very optimistic. So understand that I know where I'm coming from here on this, okay? And I think you're going to throw cold water all over it. But so with all of the tariffs that Trump says he's going to impose in talking about importing and exporting, take, for example, and obviously that's going to hurt Canada because of how much Canada relies on dealing with the U.S. on that front. But say, like, the U.S. has sold an enormous quantity of corn to Mexico. U.S. corn accounted for more than 85% of Mexico's corn imports last year alone. And there's a Trump presidency that could bring massive tariffs on vehicles imported from Mexico. Maybe a trade war would then ensue. Might there be an opportunity? That's just one example. But might there be an opportunity for Canada to step in where the U.S. has bailed in dealing with other countries in terms of importing and exporting? Now, maybe with that example, maybe Mexico, because of geography, maybe Mexico would be more willing to go to Brazil for their corn needs. But is there a way where Canada could step in where the U.S. is bailing on some other countries? So
definitely possible. I was actually talking to Neil Townsend from Grain Fox, a great commodity analyst, this morning for our show, and we were talking about this. For the Canadian market, if we get into some sort of a trade war on some agricultural commodities or other products that are going into the U.S. and we can't get them, its flow is restricted, so to speak. We ship 75% of our agricultural exports to the U.S. So to find other markets, there's not a lot of other markets the size of the U.S. We're dealing with a lot of inventory. Are there places for us to pick around the edges when it comes to, like, say, the U.S. and China get into a trade war and China doesn't take any more U.S. beef? Maybe that's an opportunity for Canada to start to ship more beef to China, as an example. So I think you're onto something there for sure. Well, what we know from the last Trump playbook on this topic of tariffs is, last week we heard on the campaign trail Trump talk about how, he may even put 100% tariff on Mexico if they don't deal with the border. And so you're putting things in place that you force the other side to negotiate away from, and you haven't given up anything. And that's we kind of learned that in Trump 1.0. It's going to carry forward in 2.0. and Canada's going to have to try to figure out its best way to get around it, because we do have some skirmishes with the U.S. Softwood lumber, market access for things like dairy, contributing 2% of our GDP to NATO. That is a stark reality at this point. So we better find that money in our budget, because that's going to be a major issue for Canada. And things like digital taxes is another example. So we're going to have to be bending on some of these issues to prevent larger consequences in the short term.
Well, Harris might have pushed the USMCA, formerly NAFTA, to take on more environmental issues and for new negotiations of that deal. Where is Trump on that front?
Well, I think we can expect, that's one of the things that Canadian farmers identified liking about, why President Trump would be good for Canadian agriculture is, probably a little bit of a more common sense approach to environmental policies. In farm country in the U.S. farmers very fed up and tired of really needless, in some cases, regulations on the environment. Waters of the United States was one of the things, that policy was one of the things that got Trump elected in farm country in 2016. So I think we're going to see a lightening up. It's going to be interesting to see what they do from a sustainability front when it comes to biofuels. Trump heavily supported in the Midwest in farm country, and you can't be popular in farm country without supporting biofuels like corn-based ethanol. But at the same time, his mind has been somewhat changed when it comes to electric vehicles, right? Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, side by side with him. And so we're going to see maybe a little bit of a different policy on electric vehicles than we saw in the first Trump administration, where he really talked out negatively about electric vehicles quite frequently. His mind is going to be different. He got like $138 million in political contributions from Elon Musk. So I think he's changed his view, so to speak. So that's something to watch out for.
Yeah, until Musk tweets something that can even be remotely interpreted as an attack on Trump, and then Trump just bails on him like he does with a lot of others that he's done in the past. Maybe it's reacting to the U.S. presidential election, but might we have that to look forward to with Real Ag Radio on SiriusXM 147?
No doubt about that whatsoever. We'll definitely be rolling a whole bunch of reaction to what happened in the election. What Canadian and U.S. farmers and ranchers, what some of the things to watch out for. Based on last night's outcome, and I'm very interested in talking about where does the Democrat Party go from here after last night's very, very disappointing results. So lots to chat about on Real Ag Radio today. Thanks so much.
And good listening. I appreciate it. Sean Haney of Real Agriculture, host of Real Ag Radio. Sean, I hazard a guess. I think I know the direction of our conversations moving forward and for some time to come. Thanks, pal.
Hey, really appreciate it, and thanks for your interest in agriculture. All the best, everybody.
Always. Thank you. There is Sean Haney.